Woolies is easily the most high-profile retail casualty of the recession so far, shedding around 30,000 staff in one hit. According to retail troubleshooter Mary Portas, their problems aren't new.
Woolworths has been stuffed for years. It's really not been performing well for years. And, you know, and then suddenly the big financial crisis has just made it have no chance. It became far too general, and a lot of the product that it had in there, you could have got on the internet. You could have got when you were doing your supermarket shop and it was accessible just to chuck it in the basket. So it didn't have anything that was really, I must go to Woolies.
And so, on the 26th of November, Woolworths went into administration.
Woolworths and MFI are both calling in the administrators.
Mohammed Dejia had worked for Woolies for 9 years when the news broke.
Before I actually went to work, I saw on the news that Woolworths went into administration. At that time, I didn't really know what administration actually meant until I actually went into work, and my manager actually explained to us what it actually meant and what it meant to us.
What it meant was the administrator Deloitte would try and find a buyer to take on Woolies as a going concern. But they failed to find an overall buyer, so instead they began to recoup as much money as they could to pay back Woolworths creditors, and they began to close the stores.
Genuinely did actually think that someone would invest in actually Woolworths and keep it actually going. It was a bit of a shock to actually say that your store is now closing down.
It was a surprise to many that Woolworths couldn't be saved.
I think, you know, the administration of breaking it up when they sold it just was not a clever idea. I would have sold it as a whole going concern, but it would have been a big risk visionary who could have saved Woolworths.
Deloitte told us that there were no viable bids to save Woolies, but it was widely reported that my Dragon's Den colleague, Theo Paphitis, did make an offer. In any case, Deloitte sold Woolies off piecemeal with the loss of 30,000 jobs.
It's not necessarily the big high-profile stuff that I'm...
Back at the panel, our experts are discussing whether more should be done to protect the interest of employees as well as creditors when companies go under.
I think there is a real issue here. I mean, in the Woolies case, the union that represents shop workers, Usdaw, I know was working very, very hard behind the scenes, talking to potential bidders who might have been able to take over not necessarily the whole of the old business, but parts of it, with a view to providing a decent number of sustainable jobs going forward, and they found it extraordinarily difficult to have a meaningful dialogue with the administrator.
And Tristan Ramers thinks administrators should try and restructure some businesses rather than closing them down.
Some of our manufacturing businesses are making profit, the margins are good, but they've got too much debt. So is that a business that would work if it was restructured? The argument is yes.
Woolworths and MFI were old models. They've been old models for a very long time, and they, to me, were the first sorts of companies that would go in this particular recession.
What I'm saying is, Ruth, there are business or there are entrepreneurs out there who would beg to differ with you because they were prepared to make, you know, real offers to save those businesses.
I don't know the exact details, but at the end of the day, with some companies, sadly, you have to say, I'm sorry, your time is up. And I thought Woolworths was one of them.
Shireen is making progress. When I met her, I gave her the number of a company I know are looking for staff. She applied for a job with them and she's had an interview.
I had to do some English tests and maths tests and mainly customer service, very challenging. But the good news is that I scored quite high. I think they said 78%. So hopefully that, you know, that should work, and I'm just going to wait and hear back now. Here we go again.
We'll find out how Shireen gets on later. In retail, the picture is bleak, with 30,000 Woolworths staff entering the job market in January. But Brian Roberts, our high street expert, thinks he might have some good advice for retail job seekers.
Mohammed, hi, how are you? Good to see you. This is Brian.
Hi, good to meet you. Good to meet you.
I brought ex-Woolies employee Mohammed Dejia to meet him.
So, Brian, what advice do you think we can give Mohammed?
Yeah, I think there are some grounds for optimism, because clearly there are some retailers, particularly in the grocery sector, who are expanding very rapidly, so it might be worth trying your luck with the people who take over your odd store that you used to work in.
How do you feel about working for somebody like Waitrose?
To tell you the truth, I've actually applied for
Oh, well
Waitrose,
done,
and,
well done.
I've actually got an interview next week with them, so it's...
So that's good advice, then.
It is actually good advice, it's brilliant advice.
Positive signs from major retailers on the high street are not mirrored in other sectors. Back at the panel, thoughts have turned to why small businesses are reluctant to employ new staff, and it's creating quite a debate.
I must say, when I talk to small businesses, one of their big problems, it's actually struggling with the employment regulations, and I have looked in these in a lot of detail. And when you do look at employment regulations, they are amazingly complex.
I mean, I disagree very strongly with Ruth's suggestion. We're already the most lightly regulated labour market, really, in just about the whole of the major industrial economies.
As an employer, Brendan, I think you're talking nonsense. I employ a number of people, and I can tell you, as an employer, the challenges that I face and the burden of bureaucracy...
So what do you want to do, Jeff? Do you not want to pay the minimum wage?
No, absolutely.
Do you not want to consult if there are redundancies coming up in a business?
I want to pay minimum wage, I want to give employees their protection.
Do you want to take away maternity rights from women that are employed in your businesses?
I don't think we've gone too far, though. Don't you think we've just gone a little too far?
I don't think we've gone far enough.
Really, we're not highly regulated in the labour
Will,
market. We're
read
not.
the regulations.
It's not like France or Germany, where you're effectively married to your employee. In Britain, actually, there is a flexible labour market. It is one of the things that we have built, and by the way, I'm strongly in favour of it, but I wouldn't make it yet more flexible.
You mentioned the regulations in France and Germany. In many of these countries, there are escape clauses for small businesses.
I think when you're having to reduce costs and you're having to let people go, I think the whole bureaucracy of the process that you have to go through, and all of a sudden, before you know it, the employee puts his hand up and say, but it's this discrimination or that discrimination, or you didn't follow this procedure or that procedure. And I just think you get wrapped up in so many issues that as an employer, I think, you know what, maybe I can't afford to hire you.
Well, you might regard it as bureaucracy, James. If you're on the other end of that process, you might think this is the minimal dignity and decency that you ought to be entitled to.
No, but I think we're not talking about taking away...
This is obviously a big debate, and one I hope is going on at the highest levels of government. If the politicians can help with the unemployment problem, it can't come quickly enough for Zach Aberdeen.
Having spent 6 months looking for a job, I've decided to go out and improve my CV, to look at management accountancy, which is a qualification that should open some more doors for me. And I still feel very positive. I still feel like there's a good opportunity out there just waiting for me.
There's good news for Shireen, though. I gave her the phone number of a company looking for staff, and she got the job.
Through this experience, I've learned that, you know, when you've been made redundant, it's not quite you that's been made redundant, it's a job. And it's always important to keep positive and keep going and, you know, ask for help when needed.
And Mohammed Dejia, who lost his job at Woolworths after 9 years, has got a new job at Waitrose.
After finishing from Woolworths, and it's really good to actually be working again.
In the last 6 months, more than 400,000 people have lost their jobs in the UK. The government may or may not be able to turn the tide in this situation.
But what we can do is help ourselves by making the most of every opportunity.